Yes, welcome to the last go-round of our study on this draft social statement. Yeah, it's possible that we have a few less people than when we started, but still a great group of people. And at first I want to start off by thanking you for participating so diligently and with the conversation that you've had so far, and with the conversation that I hope that you have tonight. Disclaimer, we're not going to get to all the answers. Just don't expect some big wrap-up of everything where it all becomes clear tonight. I am going to invite you into more conversation about some specific things, but maybe not the specific things that are sort of the issues of the day. But I do think all these things have something to do with the difficulty we're having with some of the issues today. So we'll see if we can get there by the end of our time together. So we're going to start just by highlighting a couple words. So this is the last section. We are, in section 6, we are addressing selective contemporary concerns, which tells you right away that we're not going to address all of them by any stretch of the imagination, so only some selected ones. And they are relatively contemporary to the context and the time that we're experiencing. But that doesn't mean they haven't cropped up before, but it does seem like we're feeling them particularly poignantly at this time and place. So that's where we're going to go. So, but before we do that, just a briefest of recaps to try and again think about where we've been and where we're going to. So, the first night, Pastor Brian came and told us, "Hey, Lutherans have some good theology to bring to this. We have some basic fundamentals that are important. We have, this notion of two hands of God, two kingdoms. We have this notion of power is exerted for the good of all, not simply for the needs of one. So we have some good theology to bring to this." The next thing we learned in Article 2 was Lutherans confess that civic participation is part of our calling. It's part of our vocation in the world. In some ways, you could say it's not optional. Now, that's not probably something that we've encountered a lot before. I mean, I'm sure you've encountered, oh, you should be a good citizen and do your civic duty and those kinds of things. But from a spiritual point of view, from a religious perspective, a theological perspective, participating in civic life, communal common life, is a calling, it's a vocation, it's a role that we have. In some ways, if we are to live out faithful lives, it's not optional. That's not the case for every kind of expression of Christianity, right? There are some expressions of Christianity that retreat from the world and kind of form a community or an enclave or something that's separate from it. And so all of that civic stuff is tainted. So we're not going to deal with that. But that's never been our understanding of it. Sometimes we've gotten too involved with it, or sometimes too quiet and not involved enough. But we do have a calling to be involved. Article 3 that we talked about was, hey, we have a constitution. That was just a mini civics lesson. Mainly we talked about we the people. What does it mean to be we the people? Who are we the people? And we talked about Article 4, that even in the Constitution, right from the get-go, amendments were needed. So in the first wording of that First Amendment has to do with the establishment and the exercise of religion. So from the very beginning, even though there's been what's been called a separation of church and state, those things have always had an interplay and an interaction with one another in various ways. Article 5 we talked about last week, that religion can work constructively with political authority. Lots of ways that can happen. And then tonight we're going to talk about the selected contemporary concerns. What are those? So as I was thinking about this, as we're going to work through these things today, two things came to mind. That there's two responses to these contemporary concerns. One is, hey, you should do this now, right? Here's a concern. Here's some positive action. Here's a decision that this, or a point of view that the study says we should do this now. And the other reaction is like, don't know. We maybe should talk about this some more. Here are some ideas. Here are some thoughts. So as we go through these various things, I'm going to try and put these in one camp or the other a little bit. And again, there's going to be this tension because we want answers. We want to go out of here saying, oh, well, this is the thing everyone needs to do. But remember, tension is not necessarily a bad thing, even within our own self. Some tension is healthy, and it allows us to create something that's not possible any other way. Music might be an example. All right. So the very first thing on Article 38, sort of another disclaimer, and that's all I'm going to say about this one. If we look on page 9 of this book, of this little handout, basically Article 38 says, hey, we're not going to revisit a whole bunch of actual issues that we've already talked about. Like, these contemporary issues are not going to include things like abortion or the death penalty or, all those other kinds of things. Those are not the issues that we're going to talk about in our selected contemporary issues. Those things have other discussions, and you can go read those. So that's sort of their initial disclaimer, right? So the first thing that we are going to talk about is this one. Stop being so partisan and polarized. Article 39. That feels like something that we should do this now. We should stop being so partisan and polarized. If you read through that article, it pretty much describes what I've heard from a lot of people, no matter what hand of politics they fall under. A lot of people talk about, oh, we're just so divided, and the discourse is unhealthy, and we're so polarized, and we should stop that. Well, that's great. In line 304, it says, the ELCA calls for a different approach as both necessary and possible. Right? Great. How do we do that? How do we do that? How do we push back against what they call a winner-take-all kind of approach that leaves some people out? How do we push back against an unhealthy polarization? They don't give us any answers in this study.
So that's what you're going to do.
So that's what I'm going to have you do. That's your first topic of conversation. And I'm going to give you extended time tonight. This isn't going to be just like talk for a minute and then I'll call the question. I'm going to give you about at least 5 minutes or more here to talk. How do you push back against this mentality of either winner takes all or might makes right or things will be better when you figure out that you're wrong and I'm not, right? How do you push back against that in your conversations with people, with friends or neighbors or family? So I thought I'd give you an easy question just to start off with. All right, go. 'Cause that's been like 8 minutes.
It only seems like 7.
And I could probably let you keep going for a while. So I'd be interested, though, to hear back. I'm actually taking a few notes tonight. I'd be interested to hear back on anything that came out of that discussion. How do we push back or counter this polarization thing that everyone thinks is so bad? Anybody got any thoughts about that?
I'll say something. When you say push back, to me that gives it a negative.
Negative, okay.
We're going to do something negative about it. And I think we need to approach it from a more positive.
Great.
And Tom mentioned humility and what?
Vulnerability.
And vulnerability. practicing humility within ourselves and vulnerability. So being willing to say, that's a good point. You know, I never thought of it that way. Little things like that. And the other thing I think is important is educating yourself. Know what the facts are as best as we can tell. I'm not sure what source that is anymore, but trying to use something other than social media to base your conversation on.
Nice, okay, good. Anybody else want to chime in?
I'm on a little tear here, so I'm going to go ahead. So this is a real passion of mine right now, and there's organizations, so I started at the beginning of this year doing this depolarization challenge, where it's something that comes into your inbox and it asks you to evaluate how you are contributing to polarization in our society. What is it that you're clicking on, and what are you sending on in your social media, or how are you interacting, and how comfortable are we with people who have different opinions from us? Can we humble ourselves to sit and just listen and not, you know, jump in and those kinds of things? And I found that to be really, really helpful. And then through that process, I've found more and more groups that are doing this work. Braver Angels is kind of a big one. And I've been reading some books about that, and there's really a good movement right now in the United States. You wouldn't think that from everything that we read, right? But there really is a movement towards depolarizing, and we could be part of that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, no, that's helpful, thank you. Anybody else want to chime in? Well, there will be more opportunities as we go, because we're going to keep discussing things. So thank you for that, and good discussion. A couple things that I wrote down too would be, when we have these conversations, endeavor to find that common ground or shared values that you have with someone, because inevitably you will find something. You will find some common ground or some shared value at some point. And so you can work from there, and that's a good piece to do. I've also was intrigued by a way that some people have ended an argument sometimes. They'll give out their whole thing and then they'll say, or it could be wrong. You know, so that again is part of this humility and approaching with the different, to go into a conversation prepared to admit that you were wrong. We just don't do that very often anymore. So maybe that's something the church has some things that we can offer. All right, number 40. Article 40. Basically, this article says civic leaders bear some responsibility for this. This polarization, this division, this partisanship. They don't bear all of it, but they bear some. So I thought, as a way to think about this, I would put up a quote from a concession speech. I don't know, can you all read that? Or should I'll read it to you. I urge all Americans who supported me to join me in not just congratulating our next president, but offering him our goodwill and earnest effort to find ways to come together, to find the necessary compromises, to bridge our differences, and help restore our prosperity, defend our security in a dangerous world, and leave our children and grandchildren a stronger, better country than we inherited. I felt like that was a pretty good concession speech. Who do you think gave that concession speech? No. It was a presidential candidate. It was, yes. Doesn't go way back, but this person has died. It's McCain. It's John McCain. So, I mean, John McCain, who was known in his life to be a, kind of a rough, he wasn't afraid to ruffle some feathers, and he had some unorthodox choices at times, and he did a few things that not everyone agreed with, even in his own party. But gave this concession speech after the election of Barack Obama, which to me, and I think to a lot of people, because it's really lifted up as a great concession speech, kind of says, look, because if you read the whole thing, and I encourage you to go do that, he talks about, hey, we had differences, we fought this out, we're still going to have differences, but he encouraged people to say, like, the election is over, now let's support our president, and let's move forward. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone did that, obviously, but it does say something about leadership having a role in fostering, our civic life. So my question about all this is, how do we hold leaders accountable for this responsibility? I don't know the answer to that. And I'm not going to probably ask you to spend 10 minutes debating that either. But I do think that's a part of our job. If leaders have this responsibility, then it's probably on the electorate too, and us as people of faith, to find some way to hold people accountable to the values that we hold together.
Plus, we are also leaders.
Yeah, exactly. So you're leaders in the circle of influence that you have, and through the ways that you participate in things. So yeah, so on a kind of a layer or two down, we have that same responsibility too.
Well, also I think leaders will not go the overly partisan route if it doesn't give them an advantage.
Yeah, right. So
if we don't follow that leader, he's not going to do that.
yeah. So, and that's so true. And at the same time, it can feel like, but it takes everybody to do that, and I'm only one person. But still, everybody is made up of a whole bunch of one persons. So, there's that starfish example of the person is saving the starfish. He can't save all of them, but he can save the life of one, right? All right. Article 41. And we already touched on this a little bit. Just the facts, please. Article 41 talks about that robust and constructive civic engagement depends upon a clear distinction between facts and various forms of misinformation, right? Question is, who and what determines what those are? That's already come up a little bit. It feels like at this point that this is something we should do now. We should just do the facts, right? But it's a little bit more complicated than that. The article quotes some scripture that we should be innocent as doves when it comes to interpreting other people's actions. This is an interesting interpretation of this text, I think. I mean, Jesus said, be innocent as doves and wise as serpents. He didn't really set the context. So this is a interesting way to go. And then that we should also be wise as serpents when we're discerning the information we come across. What do you think about that? Does that ring true or not with you? Just throw your hands up in the air and tell me what you think. Yeah? Yeah?
I guess your responsibility to study and discern, not just to talk.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a professor I had at the University of Nebraska who always used this comment. How a person sits depends on how he stands. In other words, you have to look beyond what he's saying. You have to look at what he does, where he is, the circumstances of his life, determine why he's taking that stance.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I would agree with that. One of my fundamental kind of principles of human behavior is people do things for a reason. I mean, so there's hardly anyone that does something. There's very few irrational people. We might think that what they're doing is irrational from our perspective. And there are some people who have conditions or circumstances that, yes, I think they do maybe do some irrational things. But from their perspective, almost always, everyone has a justification for what they're doing, which makes it rational. So our job is sometimes to see where they stand and understand that a little bit. No, that's a good point. Here's a quote from that article. For the sake of U.S. civic life, the ELC calls upon social media platforms to take responsibility, to align policies and procedures worldwide with the most comprehensive and rigorous online protocol available. Tell me what that means.
Great idea.
The opposite of what you're doing.
Well, see, to me that says almost nothing. I don't know what protocols or rigorous online things are. I don't know any of that.
Right, and to put a company in charge of deciding what?
Yeah, I mean that's one of the, and see that's it's one of the experiments we're having as a whole society. I mean, in COVID in that way was an experiment of a social experiment as much as it was medical, right? How are we going to react? Who are we going to trust to tell us the truth? Who are we going to trust to keep other information away from us? Some people were very upset with information that was taken down. Other people were very upset with information that was left up. So this is a consequence of where we are as a society right now. It doesn't have to do so much with bad people and good people. We have at our fingertips now the power for any singular person to project their opinion onto the entire world. That's never been remotely possible in all of human history. So we have to rethink everything now.
Now, some of that is not just speech. Some of that's detecting deep fakes and
Right.
AI, which I think is something that they can do that is not a big concern.
Right, so maybe we need to unpack what it is that we're asking companies to do. You know, what is, if we don't want them to censor speech or thought or opinion, perhaps their role is to censor inauthentic, right? You know, manipulative things, which is going to become an ever increasingly important task, right, in the world of AI and computer-generated images. I mean, we are very, very short leap away from being able to hold down your phone, tell it what you want it to have a picture of, and for that thing to show up extremely realistic so that almost no one could tell that it wasn't a real picture or video. I mean, we are in the stone's throw of that. I mean, sometimes it's actually possible right now, but there are people who are pretty good at being able to see it. But for the mass public, not so much. Yeah. Just the facts. Sorry. What can be done about misinformation? So I'm going to let you talk about that for a little bit more. We primed that pump a little bit. So take a minute and talk about what can be done about misinformation. If you don't like that term, put in another one there. I mean, people call it lots of things, right? So, what can be done about that? Go.
Yeah.
More great conversation. So, let's hear some ideas. So, I'd be interested in what you talked about. What can be done about misinformation?
Well, at our table, we talked about relationship. So like if you're talking with a family member or a friend and they say something that's startlingly, probably misinformation, we'll just say it that way. Karen talked about somebody on Facebook who posted something crazy. And instead of saying, this is crazy, she said, it just was a gentler approach. And she was talking to cousin, yeah. So it was somebody that she has a relationship with. And she simply laid out some other things in a consider this
Right. Yeah, relationship. Okay?
As I was looking and thinking through it, how many of us thought that misinformation was somebody else's misinformation, not our own?
So maybe look in the mirror sometimes. Okay?
Yeah.
Education. Okay, yeah. We're going to get more to that a little bit later too, but that's key. Yes, Katie.
Remembering that social media shows you what's most popular and not what is the best sources. So I like to think of it as a popularity contest, and we don't trust a lot of those, you know, in like our own life. So
Yeah. Yeah. No. Again, we're just barely learning how to deal with this newfound power that humanity has. Okay. Anybody else? Misinformation? Nobody wants to just like wipe it all out and just put out the truth, you know? Yeah, there's a whole media company called Truth Social, right? So this is the truth, right? This is, I mean, it's kind of a battleground. I mean, I don't have any examples right off the cuff, but I know it wouldn't take very long to do a little bit of research to find misinformation in history. It's been happening a lot. Even doctoring of photographs goes all the way back for a long period of time.
We call it propaganda.
You what?
We call it propaganda.
Yeah, called it propaganda. Yeah. And everyone did it. I mean, it wasn't just German government, you know, American government, Chinese government, Japanese government, you know, you name it. We all want to tell the story from our perspective and make us to look the best. That's human nature of all human beings. So, well, like I said, there's not an answer for that, but I do like the fact that starting with the relationship is important. You know, there's an old adage, you can be right or you can be in a relationship. You know, a lot of this is interpersonal stuff, right? I mean, how many of the world's big problems, like the big violent problems, could be solved if the people who have the actual power had a better relationship with one another? You know? But, so that's a key thing. We brush it off, but it's really, really powerful stuff, relationship. All right. 42. Follow the money. Follow the money. The ELCA affirms that every citizen should have the opportunity to play a free and active part in the foundation of our communities, but we're concerned that being heard shouldn't be limited to those individuals and organizations that have overwhelming financial wealth and resources. Follow the money. Financial contributions are free speech. This is what we've decided as a society. That corporations are people under the law, which sounds weird, I know. A lot of people didn't agree with that Supreme Court decision. But that's what, when you look at corporate history, that's what the word corporate means. It's a body, right? It means it's a body. So I can understand the perspective that a corporation is a person, but also under that same understanding, then that corporation should have responsibility and accountability as a person does under the law too. So it goes both ways there. But there's an ongoing discussion that there are some voices that are way, way, way louder in our society than others because they have way, way, way more resources and can use those resources to sway not only politicians but public sentiment. Because we are psychological beings, we respond to even subliminal messages sometimes, and so these resources are employed for a kind of a manipulative means.
I think there is one issue with that
Yeah.
that could be solved, and that is making sure that those who contribute, their names are publicized as part of contribution.
Could you repeat
Because
that?
many of the problems we have now with money under the table kinds of things is that nobody knows.
Right. So he's making the point, this issue could be solved if we just knew names. If we had transparency. And that's actually one of the things that's the study calls for. Pretty solid kind of thing. We should have more transparency. So on lines 325, they urge legislation to set limits on campaign contributions and increase transparency. Reasonable limits, I don't know what reasonable limits are, but I think even more so than limits is just knowledge. But yeah, for right now, there is a huge loophole that people can give unbelievable amounts of money and resources, and there's zero accountability for it. You don't know where it comes from. There's no limits on what it can be spent on. And there was a brilliant depiction of it. In my opinion, there's a brilliant depiction of this from a movie from a couple years ago. I don't know if any of you saw this movie. It's called Irresistible. Anybody seen this movie? We did. So this was a late night comedian's project when he stopped his day job or his night job. So Jon Stewart helped produce this little thing. And when you start watching this movie, and I'm going to give away a little bit of the plot because it's so important to what we're talking about. When you start watching this movie, you're thinking, oh, this is going to be some commentary on left and right politics because it's about a Democrat who's running for, and everybody gets all excited about him, and the higher ups in like DC come down and get all excited because here's a candidate that's going to beat the Republican in this swing state, and well, that brings out the Republican hard hitters, and they all get involved, and everybody starts raising tons of money, and they form super PACs, and at the end of the thing, what you find out is the race is really between two friends and neighbors who don't really care about anything, but they needed some money for their town to fix the school and some other stuff, and so they just used all the super PAC money to do that. Because they could. There was no law that prevented them from that. People threw all this money into their campaigns, and then they just spent it on whatever they wanted to, which for them was their community. It's a really pointed critique of the system. That we get all excited about the partisan nature and forget the actual real needs of people and communities. So it's a fun little flick. Yeah.
I mean, transparency alone doesn't, like I just read that, I think it was Ricketts contributed $500,000 to some campaign, and I don't even know what it was for. And so we know he contributed it. That's the only money in that campaign. So that's the only campaigning we're going to get.
Yeah, I know.
So, we do know where it came from, but it's
Still, yeah, so that's why it maybe needs to be paired with other things. This is something society has to discuss. And as people of faith, if we bring that back to that, our kind of animating core is the good of all, right? So is this good for our neighbors and not just good for me? I mean, we all belong to, or could belong to, any number of political advocacy organizations. When I was farming, there's the corn growers, and there's the soybean association, and there's the this, and there's the that. And all those things are important and good. They promote a point of view that not everybody else sees, and so there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But at some point, isn't it good to also have advocates for people who don't have advocates? So maybe the church can have a role there.
I was just going to say, back to some of the other things, there was an old song I used for the Call Equal. And if you look back, even like to the campaigns where you were talking about transparency, you wonder how many countries are contributed to the candidates to throw, for their favor. And then you look at even our own government and the power and the greed and the corruption even in our own government. And a lot of it stems from the power, the greed, and a lot of them have been in there so long. They just think they run. It's not like they're elected anyone. It's their right to do it. Very scary.
Yeah, so I mean, it's something that from the get-go or the founding of this country that we realized There had to be checks on things, balances with things. So part of our, I think, our civic duty as people of faith too is to recognize, again, using those fundamental theological concepts of everybody's a sinner and everybody's a saint. I mean, we all have the capacity to really screw things up, and we probably will all want to follow the money, given the chance that there needs to be checks in the system to prevent that. So I don't have the full answer to what that is. It just feels like that's an important piece.
I don't think this is a full answer, but it kind of leads to maybe having us support the candidates with government funds and say, okay, you have X amount of money to spend for your campaign, you have X amount of time, and cut out all the other.
That's super interesting.
It's the same, isn't that? I mean,
that's an interesting thing, and they do that in some countries. I think in England, there's only a 3-month campaign
would that not be
season. Like, you can't start campaigning until it's 3 months ahead of the election. That's it.
Because now we start, as soon as the one election's done, they're already talking about who's running in 4 years. But if we had that, put a hold on the money, we take care of it. You get this to spend and still follow the money. They probably figured out a way. But it might allow other people who don't have money to begin with to even, I don't know.
That's another thing about this whole thing is that the system is becoming more and more so that only certain people can actually hold office. You know, you have to have a significant amount of resources to even think about running for office. I mean, even local, you know, races are, you know, pretty intense now. School board and, you know, other things. And so, yeah. All right, we're going to keep moving. That's a lot of good discussion, though. Now, article number 43. Even good intentions cause harm. Luther said, all our righteous deeds are like a filthy rag. And by that he meant the rag people used instead of toilet paper. I mean, so all of our righteous deeds are not all that. We tend to think our righteous deeds are fully righteous, but that's never the case for anyone. And so that's part of what we have to think about. That policies need intentional review for the good of all people. And that's easier said than done. It's an obligation to kind of seek reform, it says here. But I don't know exactly how that works. This is another one of those articles. I just put a big question mark beside it in my thing, because I'm like, yeah, I guess, but I don't know how we're supposed to do that exactly. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that particular.
Just that it ties into number 42, where it says ELCA urges legislation. Like, it urges legislation for what?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Even our calls for righteous legislation, we have to realize are always tainted with some injustice. None of us ever has the complete right answer here. Okay, we're going to move on to Article 44. Being a citizen is complicated. The church includes people harmed by the state. So they make the point that the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, has members in D.C., which is not a state, U.S. territories, which are not states, and don't have the same rights and privileges of others, that many times people in these areas are among those who have the least power in the system. They get overlooked. You know, so how do we deal with that? There's a lot of complicating factors in line 338. There's a lot of complicating factors that include a legacy of racism. We recognize that these are complex issues. Again, this feels like there's a lot of here. I don't know exactly what to do except to recognize that this is legitimate, that it's complicated and hard. The church is filled with people who have both benefited from the system and who are being, in some ways, crushed by it. So, and we all belong to the same church. institutional church, let alone the same kind of body of Christ nature of the church. So it's complicated. And I think that's just important to carry with us whenever we go and whenever we have conversations. That our experience is by no means everyone's experience. And it always makes me shake my head when a politician will say, well, the American people want, or the American people think. It's like, well, there's a lot of different American people. And I never know exactly which batch of American people they're talking about. Any other thoughts there? All right, we're going to move on to a related topic here. Yeah, I said we might start with actual conversations between groups of people, which is hard to do, but not impossible. You know, but we don't have conversations with people in Puerto Rico or Guam or, you know, other places that aren't mainland United States. Number 45. The study, or the draft statement, I should be more precise. The draft statement makes a particular point to say indigenous peoples have been especially harmed in this whole business of complicated citizenship. And I don't even really know where to start with that because it is so complicated. And we're still unpacking all the layers of that and still coming to grips with some of the things that happened or were done, even including, you know, schools not far from Omaha for Native American children. And the complicated and difficult history that leaves with people. How many of you have heard of the doctrine of discovery? Yeah, never heard of that? So this is an interesting thing. I had really never heard of this either. Did anyone study the doctrine of discovery in school? You did? Maybe college? Okay. It's not something that many people talked about because it was assumed. But it's an actual doctrine that was used by the Supreme Court in one famous incident. But also, I could pull up some papal degrees that were made based on this. Essentially, the doctrine of discovery is a sophisticated and kind of ruthless adaptation of finders keepers. The problem is, nothing was lost. And nothing was discovered. Because people were living here. People were living everywhere. They weren't lost. They knew nothing was lost or discovered, just to one particular group of people. So one segment of humanity said, hey, we found something new, we're going to take it. And another segment of humanity said, hey, we've been here the whole time. What about us? And so there was a religious justification that this was God-ordained doctrine, that if you, that especially European Christianity had a duty and a right to come, enlighten people and spread Christianity to where it hadn't been spread before. And so this was a thing that we'll get to in a minute that was repudiated by the ELCA not that long ago. Manifest Destiny we've probably heard about, yeah? You heard about it in school, studied it maybe. You've heard of that term?
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember hearing about Manifest Destiny. It always had a kind of positive hint to it. It was a way of explaining, like, why we kept going west, right? Go west. Well, it was just our destiny to do this, you know? But that also was rooted in this sort of quasi-religious sentiment that God had ordained this superior culture to kind of take over all the other ones. And this superior culture did that in large part by lying and going back on treaties that they had made with the people who were here to begin with. You should all take note of Paul Hedren, who's a member here. His next book that's coming out will have a lot of this perspective from it, because he's writing it more from the perspective of the people who were here in the land. So the ELCA has repudiated this and called for confession and continued advocacy to support Indian self-determination and well-being. That's kind of on the last line of Article 45. And here's the kind of piece about that. The ELCA adopted a resolution titled Repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery in 2016 at our church-wide assembly. It acknowledges the church's complicity in the historical injustices perpetrated against indigenous peoples, and it committed the ELCA to work towards healing and reconciliation with indigenous communities. So that's a start. It's not anything at all the full measure that's needed, but it's a start. Anybody have any thoughts about that, or any conversation you've had about that particular piece? Sometimes you'll see, if you've been at a conference, or if you go to an event, or even sometimes just read something that's been published, you'll see a land acknowledgement. Anybody heard about land acknowledgements? So land acknowledgement simply kind of begins with an acknowledgement that, hey, really bad stuff happened to people who used to live here. We were a part of that, and we acknowledge that this was their homeland. That's a very, very simple way of putting it. It's a tricky thing. Some people it gets very political. But I at least try to hear it, like you've all talked before, as simply saying to another human being, hey, we see you and we recognize there has been harm done here. And that's at least a starting point, even if it's not at all the complete thing that's needed to be done. But when I've talked to a few people, because I haven't talked to all that many people, from that perspective, they have said, hey, at least it helps us to know you are thinking about this, and have at least recognized that we have been in a very difficult position. So that's about all I'm going to say on that one, and we're going to finish up here with the last couple here. Education is vital. We need to teach those kids stuff in school. Did all of you have a civics class? Or government class? Yeah, well. What do you think the curriculum would look like if schools taught civics and the whole history of the United States? Whose history? Yeah, there's the question right away. The people's history, right? There's a famous book, The People's History. Whose history? History is always a story, a narrative that somebody comes up with. There's a battle over that right now, right? In different states, wanting to teach different things about history and highlight different areas. And maybe that difference is not all that bad. I don't know. Maybe it needs to be battled out in the, quote, marketplace of ideas. But somebody's got to decide this, what it looks like. But it does feel like it's something we should be doing, educating people. It feels to me, I don't know what you think, that those folks should be educators and not maybe politicians. I don't know. Who gets to decide what's taught? I mean, it's a fair question to ask. Any thoughts on that before that's one of the last things we're going to talk about. I'm going to give you about a 2-minute, this will be a short one. Talk about that. Who gets to decide what we teach? Go. All right. Yeah. This is another topic that we could just talk for a long time on, because it is a hot topic, and it's very relevant right now because that discussion is being had. Who gets to teach kids? I have a good friend who lives in Germany. He's a German citizen, and he was even becoming dismayed that, what he learned when he was, in school, which he's about the same age as I am, is not what they're teaching kids today. And in his point was, from his perspective, there was a much higher intention on teaching the difficult German history of World War II when he was in school than there is today. So, which made him uneasy. So it's a problem across many different cultures and trying to decide what we teach our children. All right. Article 48, which is kind of where we end. There's not a single solution here, but you got to start somewhere. The ELCA urges both its members and all U.S. residents, that's a powerful statement right there, to renew their efforts towards a robust civic participation guided by the well-being of all. That's great.
I think it's interesting it doesn't say U.S. citizens.
Oh yeah, it says residents. Yeah?
So often
You like that, U.S. residents? Yeah. Yeah, we haven't even tackled that tricky topic, of who exactly is who can participate in the conversation, right? Who's a resident, who's a citizen, who can vote, who can't vote. That's another whole topic. Yeah, so that's a question that's got a lot of by it. Like, how do we, what does that mean? How do we do that? But maybe that's the conversation we really need to have. Is how do we continue to urge one another towards a robust civic participation? All right, we just have a couple minutes, and this was going to be the end until JP came early and gave me this idea. And she gave me this idea. So there's a piece of paper on your table. Grab a piece of paper, and this is just, what I'd like to do is this is your evaluation of the class. So grab a piece of paper, and if you'd be so kind, in a very short thing, just a sentence, what's one thing you took from this discussion? Or maybe one thing you might do. Just very short. Just give me something to make it feel like I wasn't a complete failure. So what's one thing that you took from the discussion, or one thing you might do? One thing. And you can just leave it on your table when you're done. And I'm going to just kind of end it there. And again, thank you for your participation. I hope that you did get at least something from it. If nothing else, just engagement with other people. And a sense that we are in it together. There's kind of no denying that. At least for people of faith, there's no denying that. We can't just completely discard or disregard segments of God's creation, of our fellow human beings. We have to find some way to live together. And that's a high calling that I'm really glad all of you have taken an interest in. Give you a minute to do that, and we'll close with a prayer tonight. All right, well, let's take a minute to pray, and then if you want to finish up writing, you can finish up after that. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Good and gracious God, we make a lot of mistakes. We don't always know where we're going. We think we do. And so we ask, Lord, that you would reach down and touch all of your people. The people in this room, the people that we know, people that think like us, the people we think are just crazy, that you would reach down and touch all of us and help us to find our common ground in you and your love for us and the giftedness of this world and just being alive Help us to cherish that and find a way through our differences. Lord, we pray that you would be with those who are in areas of violence and suffering, those who are wondering about what they will eat tonight and tomorrow, those who have been working the past few days to gather their belongings and try and find a new home to live in. Help us all to share in that common burden of living in a broken world, so that in that sharing we may touch a glimpse of you. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Tim,
Yeah.
could you just take a minute and kind of walk us through where this goes, the system process with this statement? And
Yeah, so this system for this draft like this is it's out for comment now. That's what we're doing. So now you're all totally free, and I'll send out an email with this link again. You're all totally free to go on to the survey site and give your thoughts. You can give your thoughts and be direct and honest and give your thoughts about what it is. And you could even say things like, well, we had a group meeting and we went through this, and here's what some people in my group said, and this seems to resonate with me. So you can give your input into it. And I think that goes until September, I want to say 14, but I'm not sure if that's right. But I'll send that information out. So then they'll take that and they'll reformulate this draft, and they will bring that then to the next church-wide assembly. I don't know that there's a second draft. I think this is their comment period. And then they'll bring it to the church-wide assembly at the next gathering. And then the people there will have the chance to amend it or change it if they want, and then vote on it if they want to accept it. And it'll become a kind of teaching statement of the church. These things aren't like canon law, but they do become sort of normative teaching statements for the church. Yep.
And there's a session at Synod Assembly.
Yes.
That is about this.
So there's an official hearing at Synod Assembly in Kearney. So if you're going to Synod Assembly, like I think a few of you are here, you can participate in that. If you're not going to Synod Assembly, you could still go there and participate, even though you're not part of the assembly. But it's an in-person live hearing that people can give input to. And people from the committee that wrote this will be there. Yeah.
and when is the church-wide synod convention? Next year?
Is it, no, the church-wide is every 3 years. Are we on, I got to think about that.
I think Brian said it was 25.
25, so next year, next calendar year. Okay, that makes sense.
And there's no guarantee it'll pass,
No,
so that could be more dialogue, but.
right, yeah. I mean, one of the more, impactful, I guess, social statements, on human sexuality passed by one vote at Synod Assembly, so, or church-wide assembly, so. Are you looking up when it is?
I was looking up when it was. Yeah, 2025.
Yeah, the vicar is on it.
July 28th through August.
Yeah, so there you go. Good questions. Anybody else? Any final thoughts? All right, thank you. Have a good night.